Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Continuing Committee on Connecticut's Development and Future. We are here today to discuss the State Plan of Conservation and Development draft, which has been in the works for many, many, many months. We are grateful to all of the hard work that went into this because we know it was more than a labor of love. Those are the extent of my remarks today. I know that Senator Rahman will not be joining us this morning, but I do see our House Ranking Member, Representative Zullo, on the Planning and Development Committee, if you'd like to make some remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Always good to see you. Welcome back. I know we'll be coming into session soon. It's nice to see you today. Looking forward to just talking about what we were all sent via email and where this process heads next. So thank you very much, and let's get started.
Thank you so much. And without further ado, I think we should get to the third section, public engagement and input on the March 2024 draft 25-30 C&D plan. Rebecca, would you like to start with opening remarks?
Sure, and I have slides I'm going to bring up on the screen. Okay. So hi, everyone. Rebecca Auger with the Office of Responsible Growth at OPM, and joining me today is Justine Phillips-Gallucci, as well as others from the Office of Responsible Growth. And we're here today really to give you an update on where we have been over the last few months, making revisions to the plan since you last saw it in March of 2024. So today we are going to give you just a recap of the overall planning process, give you some information on the feedback that we've heard on the March draft, what we have revised, are in the process of revising to submit to you for December 1st, and then the next steps in the process. And you were sent a draft of the plan that reflects our revisions from the March draft. That is by and large substantively the draft that we anticipate sending you by December 1st. We still have some formatting cleanups to do, minor editing, but that is by and large what we anticipate transmitting before the end of the month. So we're here today on the culmination of basically 2 years worth of work. OPM really started to dig into this process in late 2022 while the CCDF was still meeting, and they had a working group that was devoted to looking at the state C&D plan and making recommendations on how to change the process and the structure of the plan itself. But we dug in and started to review the existing plan with our sister state agencies and really talk through the perceptions of the plan, what the strengths of it were, the deficiencies, and how as agencies we needed to create something that was more beneficial to our work. Excuse me. So we proceeded with that. We kicked off with you as the continuing committee in the spring of 2023, and we've met with you 3 times over the process. We really dove into agencies' plans and programs over the summer of 2023 and working with them to develop a consensus on a new framework for the C&D plan. We moved into the fall of 23 seeking public input on a new framework for the plan and heard from a lot of advocacy organizations during that process. We then spent the fall into the winter of 23-24 developing that draft that we took out to the public in March, and proceeded to have a series of meetings that I'll get into later with several different groups of stakeholders, and heard a lot of good feedback that led to the revisions that we're here with today. So after the required publication of the draft plan on March 1st, we conducted a series of meetings, 18, with different organizations. We did it with several state agencies, one-on-one. We did it with each of the 9 COGs and their municipal members. And then we had public sessions that were open to anyone as well. We got a lot of feedback just orally during those public meetings, but we also received written comments from different COGs, municipalities, and public stakeholders, as well as 6 state agencies. And the feedback which we provided to you as an attachment to the invitation to this meeting, cataloged, it was a lot of good substantive feedback, generally positive on the new framework of the plan. I think you could find concerns that the plan is too conservation oriented, but you could also find concerns that the plan was too development oriented. So we think maybe we're somewhere in the middle. There also was agencies expressing concern over some of the new implementation requirements that we're proposing, but we've had discussions with those agencies, and we are not definitive in exactly how the implementation will roll out with agencies, and are very open to working with them on a process that works for all. So with that, there aren't a lot of significant revisions to the draft that we sent out in advance of this meeting. The revisions that did take place really focused in on a couple of areas. One, there was a placeholder section in the plan to describe the planning process that's now completed. And then a lot of the text changes were in the targets that are within each of the 5 vision areas, and they were primarily clarifications and or additions to the targets to get a little more specific and just refine some of the language. There were some really basically wordsmithing revisions to the policies section that overall broad 8 policies, as well as the implementation measures. And then there was a much more significant refinement of the methodology to develop the locational guide map, which we'll talk about in a minute. So obviously, we'd encourage you to review the entire draft plan, but if you're really focused on what's changed between March and now, I would say look in the target sections of the 5 vision areas, as well as the write-up on the locational guide map. So just a really quick breeze through again, our guiding principles have not changed. They are sustainable, equitable, and just, vibrant, and resilient. Our 5 vision areas, which are our 5 priorities for this planning period, are a thriving economy, housing for current and future residents, stewardship of resources, healthy people and places, and connected and inclusive communities. Again, the 5 overall have not changed. Within each vision area, you'll find the vision statement, current strengths and challenges, which is really a data review, and then targets that are born out of those strengths and challenges, which are policy statements that are meant to guide agencies in their planning and program development. And again, it's those target areas that saw probably the most revision. We still have, it was Appendix A in the March draft. It's now Appendix B, this plans and programs section, which is really a resource that we intend to try to keep up to date. We've already actually converted it into a database format, so it's more easily searchable and more easily kept up to date with our agencies. But again, it's a catalog of plans and programs that are relevant to the C&D plan. The 8 broad policy statements of the plan, again, some minor wordsmithing in these, but they remain basically the same. And these are, again, intended to guide agencies in their planning and really sort of in their operations. The implementation measures are the policy statements that are much more geared towards actions that agencies take that are required to be consistent with the C&D plan. And as we've discussed with you before, we are proposing in the plan that there be some legislative change to increase the threshold of the actions that are required to be consistent with the plan, not the type of action that would remain. It's either acquisition of property, development or improvement of real property, or acquisition of transportation equipment and facilities. But we are proposing to increase the threshold from $200,000 where it sits today to $1 million based on previous discussions with you, in exchange for some form of documentation from agencies on how they are determining consistency with the C&D plan. And this is where we've heard some concern from agencies, especially those like DOT who fund a lot of projects that are over $1 million. And so we've had discussions about how maybe we do this at a programmatic level rather than an individual project level with those types of agencies to say, hey, how are you setting up the parameters around this program to find projects that would be consistent with the C&D plan, rather than necessarily trying to document consistency on each and every individual plan. So those discussions are ongoing with agencies, and we think that we can work through that, and it may be different among different agencies. But again, the implementation measures that are in the plan, not a lot of substantive change to these since the March draft, but these are geared towards those actions and helping agencies to determine how they are consistent with the plan. And the intent with these was that an agency would have to think through all of them, not just pick out the ones that are supportive of the whatever activity they're about to undertake. The other implementation proposals are by and large the same. We are proposing that an ad hoc implementation committee consisting of agency staff be created and maintained during the life of the plan. We think this is where we can work out how to develop a process for documenting consistency with the plan, as well as just providing an opportunity for agencies to better collaborate around planning and development issues, whether they're policy driven, programmatic, funding, other issues. We again would like to keep that resource of plans and programs up to date, and this would be an avenue for us to make sure that happens. And then one thing that we have added since the March draft, in discussions with agencies, we've talked about developing a GIS resource to identify agencies' activities around the states, or at least trying to establish such a resource so that if you're working in one agency, you may not be aware of what, 3 other agencies have funded or worked on in an area that you might be looking at. And it would be helpful to understand, if DOT's been working in this neighborhood and you are at DPH looking to do something, it would just be very helpful and again, foster that collaborative approach that we are seeking with this C&D plan. We are also proposing that this committee meet at least annually. I know OPM is required to give you a report on implementation annually. I don't know if you read that or not, but I thought that, if you met annually just to hear from other agencies, from OPM, how is it going? How is implementation? It also gives you some continuity so that when you go to update this in 5 years, you have a better sense of what's been happening. And then finally, we're proposing as OPM to offer opportunities on a regular basis. Not sure if it'll be quarterly, twice yearly, for stakeholders to engage with us around implementation and issues that they're finding so that we can be a better conduit to our sister agencies as well as you to understanding what issues are out there. So the other area that really did see some substantive change since the March draft is the locational guide map. And as we've discussed with you previously, we are not including a priority funding area map in this iteration of the plan. However, we've tried really hard to think through a new way to approach mapping at this level, at a statewide level. And we feel like we have created a useful map of existing conditions around the state that could help guide agencies in applying the policies that are within the plan in their work. And so I'm going to turn it over to Justine to talk through the locational guide map.
Great. So since the last meeting, we've made significant changes to the methodology for developing the locational guide map in response to feedbacks from comments and the stakeholder outreach sessions. So just to reiterate, this map is intended to be descriptive of current conditions across the state, identifying what we're calling activity zones of varying types and intensity. As we know that employment hubs, transportation assets, civic uses and institutions, cultural attractions, and commercial features are present in our most dense urban areas, but have also dispersed widely across the state, creating pockets of activity and opportunity. So the presence of multiple components or specific key components at different thresholds enabled stratification of our activity zones by level of intensity using the weighted overlay tool in ArcGIS Pro, which scales the input data on a defined scale, weighs each according to its importance, which we defined, and adds them together. So the biggest change since the last draft is that during the stakeholder outreach process, several members of the public commented on the need to evaluate urban and rural activities separately. Because our analysis is based on the density of features where they're clustering, large discrepancies in the number of assets in urban areas and rural essentially washed out all of that detail in the less dense rural centers. So we thus relied on the US Census Bureau's urban areas classification to delineate between urban and rural parts parts of the state, isolating the data that fell inside and outside of those areas respectively so that we could run separate analyses that take into account the different levels of intensity, types of activities, and the importance of differing importance of features in these different contexts. So based on this analysis, we identified 5 types of activity zones, and these have also changed since the previous draft, characterized by different types and intensities of activity present within. So first we have major activity zones, and these are the very densely developed urban centers that cluster high amounts of activity in small geographic areas, including significant institutional and civic uses, unique cultural resources, commercial assets that serve a wide population, robust pedestrian and transit networks, and high volumes of daily traffic. These include our 5 major cities: Hartford, New Haven, Stamford, and Waterbury and Bridgeport. The next classification was regional activity zones, and these are dense centers within regions of the state like Middletown, New London, or Danbury, or peripheral areas generally surrounding our major activity zones. These cluster a significant mixture of uses, including commercial, civic, cultural, and transportation-related assets, but may not include all or the institutional uses of a major activity zones or the very high volumes of traffic. Next were our local activity zones, and these have relatively high commercial uses and more moderate clusters of civic and cultural assets. These are often located along or adjacent to transportation corridors and generally have lower non-residential building density than the major regional activity zones. The next classification is suburban activity zones, and these included town centers or areas peripheral to more intense activity. These tend to have strong commercial, civic, and transportation-related uses spread over larger geographic areas. And then finally, we had rural activity zones, and these are clusters of civic, cultural, and some commercial uses in relatively small geographic areas at less concentrated levels. These included traditional village centers and other nodal areas of activity within the less densely developed regions of the state. So this is a closer look at the map. Again, rural activity zones only occur outside of the U.S. Census Bureau's designated urban areas. You can also see that the activity zones do not follow natural geographic boundaries and thus can only be interpreted as an illustration of the relative location and intensity of activities. We also included a variety of conservation factors on the locational guide map to depict the locations of valuable natural and environmental resources, as well as areas of concern for hazard mitigation purposes and resilience. This is to help illustrate the interconnection and the need to balance conservation and development priorities, and to highlight opportunities for different kinds of conservation activities, such as management of the built environment to protect riparian corridors or promoting green space protection in more urban areas. It's also important to note that the areas falling outside of the activity zones are not devoid of activity, but that the activity present there is of a different nature, density, or intensity. And again, as we're proposing that this iteration of the locational guide map is not intended to be used for site-specific decision-making, location outside of activity zones shouldn't preclude state investment. Rather, it should help agencies contemplate the appropriateness of a certain action, such as large-scale development in places that don't have the density of resources to support it sustainably.
All right. Take a breath. All right. So that's the bulk of the changes since the March draft. And so just to refresh your memories on where this goes from here, we are required by statute to submit a final version of this draft to you by December 1st. And then this continuing committee is required to hold a public hearing within 45 days of the opening of the next session. And then following the close of that public hearing, you have 45 days to submit your recommendations as this committee to the full General Assembly. Now, included in the draft plan are some legislative proposals, including repealing the priority funding area chapter 297A, as well as revising section 16A-31 to increase the thresholds for those actions that are required to be consistent. And so I don't know how you as a committee want to approach trying to have legislative changes kind of accompany this plan as it's shepherded through the General Assembly. So we're happy to help you in however we can on that, but we look to you for direction on how to approach that.
Majority Leader Rojas?
No, thank you. I guess the first question would be, and trying to remember back to when I chaired P&D, you submit the plan, we have a public hearing. It doesn't necessarily have to go through a committee again because we are the committee. So then therefore it just ends up going straight to the floor for a vote.
Yeah, and I think it's typically gone as a resolution
Right.
from the committee.
Thanks, because I'm also going to need that reminder. Senator Austin.
Thank you. I want to go back to the map for a minute to talk a little bit about the Native American. You're using purple and pink here. I think that we have to figure out, it just gets lost in the activity zones. And so I don't care what the color is. I was thinking more of a, you know, a true orange or a true mustard color, something that brings it out so that we can actually see it, because I'm looking in the Northwest Hills for the Scattercoats. I can't tell if they're even included in here.
They are, and that was an oversight on my part. I totally meant
It's
to.
not
do
an
those
oversight
now.
on your
So,
part.
no,
It's
please.
really not. This has been my issue,
you.
not really yours.
No, but that they are included, and yes, I will absolutely make sure the colors
And,
are listed.
you know, we have more in Eastern Connecticut, and it's hard to sort of pull them out. And I don't, from the state perspective, the state recognizes 5 tribes, and they're all state recognized tribes. 2 are, in addition to that, also federally recognized. And there is possible movement under the BIA for them to have an opportunity to resubmit their applications. But that being said, for the purposes of this map, I'd like to have a clearer delineation of what that is, so that the casual statement that they're going to come in and take all our land, well, I could debate that, but let's get beyond the debate of that piece. The map actually shows that that's not true. That has not happened ever. So I want to sort of be able to point to that, to talk about the issues relative to that. And then part of this was about housing. And so I have some continuing frustrations relative to the housing discussion. So today I was talking with one of my colleagues at a World Kindness breakfast, because it's World Kindness Day. But we talked a bit about housing, and the housing people, I've heard numbers that we need 90,000 new housing units, but is there any way to really, and I don't know, maybe it's not appropriate to have it in the POCD, but we've built thousands and thousands of units and the numbers keep going up. So today on one of the radio stations, it was saying we need 100,000 now. And not only do we need 100,000, we need another 100,000 for just low income. So I'm getting increasingly concerned that we're really not paying attention to what we're doing and coming up with actual numbers. I think the numbers are not dedicated number that someone gets on the air and they say, oh yeah, we need 90,000. We've built 20,000, so it doesn't go down to 70,000. It goes up to 100,000 when our population in the state is not essentially changed. Now, I agree we need more housing for lower middle income and middle income folks. But I'm confused, and I'm actually not confused. I'm concerned that what we're looking at is not a real number, that people are just throwing something up and trying to figure it out. So I just don't know if that's, again, is there going to be, because this is something for the next 10 years, give or take, is that something as a clear issue? Is it going to have its own separate component of the plan, housing itself?
Sure. So one thing, this is only a 5-year plan, so keep that in mind. And this is an overarching comprehensive plan. It is not a housing specific plan. So one of our vision areas is around housing, and there's
Right.
a lot of policy statements in there, but there is not a number set out because
Okay.
this is, again, keeping housing as one of our top 5 priorities. That's tantamount to all of our other priorities, and really trying to put it in the context of broader planning thinking.
Right.
Because obviously housing is associated with transportation and employment
Correct.
and economic development and and resilience issues, right? And so this is that overarching plan. The state has several other plans that are specific to housing, including the consolidated plan. OPM is working on the fair share housing study with a consultant at the moment.
Right.
So there are those specific plans. CHAFA has recently updated their needs analysis. So this is not an attempt to,
When you talk to Chafa,
yes,
can you please tell them that it would be really helpful if they would stop discriminating against the 3 counties in Eastern Connecticut, which are not allowed to get competitive grants? They said that nobody wants to move to our area. Not true. We have a lot of housing needs there, but Wyndham, Tolland, and New London County, by the action of the Chafa board 3 years ago, was only 1% of all our land is considered priority for competitive grants. I've talked to them. I've met with them. I've done op-eds. I've done the whole thing, but really this is getting to be a little bit ridiculous when we're talking about housing and they're saying, forget those Eastern Connecticut counties, all 3 of them. We're not gonna bother to include them.
so we have been discussing with them because their qualified allocation plan, which sets the parameters on a lot of their funding, is required to be consistent with the C&D plan. And we've been talking to them about how they've used the current plan in their QAP, because they've relied on that priority funding area map in a way that we didn't even know they were doing.
Yep.
And so we've already talked to them about how they're going to update. They have to update the QAP for, I believe, in 2025 anyway, but how they need to update it to not rely on that priority funding area map. And maybe there's a way to use this locational guide map in an appropriate manner. So we have been having some discussions with them. I'm not entirely aware of what you're raising as an issue, but
I can send you the data on it. I have it. I just, it's something that I think that we have to actually have a real conversation about. If that's a third of the land mass in the state of Connecticut that essentially is being told by Chafa, we're not interested in you. And I might have a further discussion during session on the time to own plan, which is not effective when I have people that can't qualify when they're just working in normal, regular, middle-class jobs, like a beginning social worker in the schools, a restaurant manager. These are not high-paying jobs, and they didn't qualify at all for time to own. So I think, and again, Eastern Connecticut. So.
Okay.
All right.
thank you.
And thank you. If you can let me know what you decide to change those colors so that they can pop out a bit. Thanks so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm just going to make one comment
Yeah.
before I hand it over to the majority leader. There's a couple things, nitpicky things that I'm happy to send an email on, just as a point of reference. There was the information about 1 in 10 Connecticut residents being food insecure. Food share, which is where it takes you when you click on the attribution. It's now, they have updated their numbers. So I think they need to be reflected in there just because they were some fairly scary numbers that came out in June. And I anticipate that they are going to be getting worse soon. So I just want to make sure that we're including not just there, but in all aspects, the most up-to-date data that we have, just so that when we're going to put this into statute, it's as up-to-date as possible. Majority
Yeah.
Leader Ross.
Thank you. And that is one of the editing things we need to go through.
Okay.
No, thank you. Well, first, thank you for all the work that you've done on this. I mean, it obviously is a comprehensive process once you look at everybody that you've engaged with and listened to, and then try to incorporate all that feedback into what is not a simple document, but a 44-page document that reflects a lot of insights and input from a lot of people. Just to the question that Senator Austin asked about the 90,000, I think the 90,000 number is all, I always see it as tied to reports that may be from the consolidated housing plan or the DOH strategic plan. But when they talk about 90,000, they're talking about individuals who are, I think, are at 30 or 60% of area median income. So that's where that number comes. That number has now been used, I think has been used by the governor as citing that's the number of openings that we have in the state of Connecticut. Therefore, we need 90,000 units to fill. If we're going to fill those jobs, we need housing for those people to live in. So I think that's where the confusion is with the number, but I think that number is, we should think about it in the context of individuals at the lowest end of the income spectrum who are lacking, who are severely housing cost burdened or significantly housing cost burdened. I forget the actual language, but it's folks at the lowest end of the spectrum. Those are the folks that we need housing for. So even though we're building lots of housing, we're largely building mostly market rate housing and not meeting the needs of individuals at that end of the income spectrum. So I just wanted to add that as context. And I think happy to speak with you about the QAP and this issue with Eastern Connecticut. And I can't remember if it was tied to the opportunity map that was existed some time ago. Right. And, you know, I mean, that's a legitimate issue, right? There are a lot of opportunities in Eastern Connecticut, but we also know Eastern Connecticut is largely neglected in so many ways. It's a health desert. It's probably a food desert, right? It's a childcare desert. So there are significant needs for our constituents who live in Eastern Connecticut. And certainly to the extent that there's demand for housing, I think that's the question, right? There's been an overall declining population in Eastern Connecticut, as we saw when we went through redistricting, which is why a district was removed in Eastern Connecticut and put in Western Connecticut. So I think it's a market demand type of tension that we have here too, but that shouldn't preclude the ability of state resources to go to Eastern Connecticut to redevelop housing or renovate housing, because I imagine the housing stock in Eastern Connecticut's old, like a lot of communities in Connecticut. Exactly, right. So there's a need to replace housing, even if there isn't population growth. There certainly should be a priority of ours to provide safe and adequate housing for the people who do live there or who are living in current housing conditions which really are unacceptable. So I think there's an opportunity to work on something there. Two, I just wanted to, you know, acknowledge and recognize the legacy of past public policy decisions that have been made by lawmakers over time and how they impact the issues that we have here today. Particularly appreciate the recognition of racial and economic segregation. It's a bold statement to put in a document like this. I mean, the one thing I would say, it's noted in the thriving economy section as being a current challenge, but I don't know that it's explicitly noted under the thriving economy targets. And certainly you make a reference to it in the housing section of the plan. I just wonder if it should be referenced in both places so that it's consistent with the challenge that you cite in one section, but also in terms of the target, in terms of how we're going to address it, that it's cited there as well too. I'm probably just going like page by page. So page 18, which is the front page for the housing for current and future residents. I wonder if we should be explicit. I mean, I think in an effort to educate the public, but also clarify some of the misconceptions we have about that 90,000 unit number. And maybe we don't stick with that because that's obviously a number that can change over time. But I wonder if there needs to be a more explicit language about meeting the needs of our most vulnerable population. Because it certainly talks about housing for various income levels, right? That captures everybody. And while I'm worried about the cost of housing for middle income folks and perhaps people even slightly above middle income, I'm particularly concerned about folks at the lower end of the income spectrum, given how hard it is to finance that type of housing. We have a challenge with financing moderate and even more expensive housing that people seem to be willing to pay for. But we know the challenges we have with financing housing at the lower end of the income spectrum. And as I said a number of times over the last couple of months, it's great that we're seeing a lot of multifamily housing being built right now, not going to meet the demand that we have. And I'm worried about what it looks like 10 years from now, right? And unless I think we're more explicit about that in a document like this, I think it's a missed opportunity to continue to shed more light on that. I'll keep ripping through. I'll try to go as quickly as I can for you here. I don't have a note on every page, so don't worry. You know, one thing that stood out to me, and you know, I don't know if this is more of a political issue than a policy one, but obviously, you know, more often than not, you can't separate the two. But the use of the language of climate change in a document like this, and whether that's appropriate or not, right? I mean, you know, obviously there's some mixed opinions about what climate change means. Does it exist? Doesn't? But using it in a document like this, knowing that it has to go through a political process, raises some concerns for me because I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on what I see to be obvious on the floor of the House when we're trying to pass a plan of conservation and development. So you've centered it at the middle of that Venn diagram. And I just offer that, I guess, as caution and a question for why we use that language versus something else, another way to describe what perhaps many of us know to be obvious. But given the political nature of the words, and they matter in this building, I think it's something that I just wanted to share while we were sitting here today too. And then if you could just a little get into I mean, looking at the map, you know, and the map has been a challenge for a long time, right? The difference between local and suburban, right? How you're really differentiating between the two. And if you have an example of a community area that's local and one that's suburban, because I think there's a lot of overlap there. And I was reading, you know, how it's written in the document, but maybe it might be helpful for me to better understand it if you can articulate it.
So it's based on the density of those features that we describe: civic, commercial, cultural, institutions, and transportation related assets, which was traffic and pedestrian involved crashes, because those are sort of areas where both cars and pedestrians are intermingling. So the suburban tends to be lower density of those features, also spread on a larger geographic area. We're thinking of local is more of a, you know, Naugatuck, like a center with relatively high commercial uses, more moderate civic and cultural assets, lower density than say the major and regional, but still have more of that. It's a smaller geographic area than we would see the features spread across that suburban, the suburban activity zone, if that makes sense. It's really about the density, I think, that we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, in this sort of zoomed in area, it's the difference between Southbury and a Naugatuck, which have a very definable downtown sort of feel, versus a Prospect and a Beacon Falls, which also arguably have, you know, a town center, but the intensity is clearly very different between those two. So you have the suburban area surrounding the downtown of Naugatuck, the local area, but then in Prospect, where it's just a less dense community, it's just that suburban center. There is no local center. There's no hotspot of significant activity.
Okay, no, that's helpful. I mean, and again, kudos to you for trying to figure out how to explain and make use of the map, because I think the visuals are very helpful to all of us who really care about this issue, but we also know it's really challenging to get at the details of what is, you know, the whole state is a small geographic area. And then because we love to do things at the micro level, right, it gets even smaller, even though a lot of the issues that I think are contemplated in the plan are regional in nature, even though we tend to think about everything from a very local perspective, which makes, I think, progress really difficult for a state like ours. And the last comment I would add is around implementation, and this is more of a us issue, not a you one, right? We pass this plan, we say we're not going to do things, and then the legislature just does what we want, right? And that is not in accordance with this plan. So I say that because I think I say that every meeting, that it's a frustration on the part of us and not you, that you continue to do all this good work. We lay out a vision for the state of Connecticut, and then we largely ignore it. So just want to put that on the record too.
I'm not seeing any hands online, so I will deliver my comments, which I guess are probably going to be closing comments. I want to start out by saying I think I've been very clear in my frustration that we often get about this much attendance at these meetings. And I further want to go on record saying that because as I was going through the plan myself, I was thinking that this is one of the most significant plans that we are trying to put into place for the next 5 years, but ultimately for even beyond that, because whatever we end up updating the 5 years after that, it will come out of this, out of the vision of this, out of these focus areas. And I cannot thank you enough for the work that has gone into this because I know it's significant and it is obviously trying to balance a lot of competing interests. I would further say, sort of as an add-on to some of the majority leader's comments, that this is a bold document. I think that while I don't disagree that we will have some pushback on the fact that climate change is sitting at the center of this, it should sit at the center of this. It has to sit at the center of this. And as we look forward to what might be happening at the federal level, this is even more incredibly important to the future survival of Connecticut. While I realize that planning and development and furthermore, the continuing committee on Connecticut is not flashy, sexy, whatever word you want to use, I think people are underestimating the power of this plan, the power of this document, and the need that we have to actually, hopefully, as a legislature, work towards what is in here, that the agencies work towards what is in here, that the executive branch is working towards that we are all just hopefully rowing in the same direction, because it is incredibly frustrating. And I'm thinking about this summer, watching that house in Oxford wash into the river. And that is what is coming for us. It is scientific fact. It is not, well, just because you don't believe in it, it doesn't exist. And so when I look at this document and I read that, those pieces of it, I am really encouraged that we are doing the right things by the residents of Connecticut to plan ahead so that we are not caught flat-footed when these emergencies continue to arise, as they will. I don't want to be Asheville, is what I'm trying to say, because I don't think they could have ever anticipated what happened there. Furthermore, I would say in terms of the language around diversity and inclusion and equitable the portions of this document that relate to that, I applaud the language, I applaud the sentiment, and my dearest hope is that that is not the most objectionable piece beyond climate change of this document. Because as we are talking about Eastern Connecticut, as we are talking about opportunity zones, there should be ample opportunity across Connecticut. And I also wonder, is it the chicken or the egg when it comes to, okay, we're saying we don't need any more housing there because there's not enough people, but there's not enough people there because there wasn't enough housing. And when I'm talking to individual town planners, I'm hearing that, well, the job is down at Electric Boat, but the folks are going to Rhode Island to find the housing. That's absolutely ridiculous. We should not be in that situation for jobs that still require you to show up in person, that you should have to live that far away. I'm getting a little off tangent here, but my point is, I can't thank you enough for the work. I do hope that those folks that chose not to engage in this process will not try to be the loudest voices opposing this document, because that will not be met with charitable feelings on my part. And so I just want to thank you for that. I don't know if there's any other closing comments that anyone else would like to make in response to what I've said, but I'm not seeing any hands online yet. Anyway, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We look forward to seeing the final. And at this point, we will adjourn the meeting. It is now 10:44. Thank you so much.